The Black Death, How the Plague Transformed Europe Forever. How was it? In October 1347, the residents of the Genoese port of Caffa on the shores of the Black Sea heard a strange sound, the creaking of ungreased rigging and the flapping of sails that no one seemed to control. 12 galleys were slowly entering the harbor, but a dead silence reigned on their decks. Instead of the usual shouts of sailors and the groaning of ropes and blocks, there were only the moans of the dying and the ominous quiet of those who could no longer utter a sound. When the first curious locals rowed out to the ships, they were met with a vision from a nightmare. On the decks lay the dead and the dying. Their bodies were covered with black spots the size of coins, and from swollen lumps in their groins and armpits oozed a greenish, foul-smelling pus. Those few still standing looked like living skeletons, their eyes sunken deep into their sockets, their skin wax yellow, and from their mouths foamed blood-streaked saliva. They could barely speak, whispering hoarsely for water and praying for death as deliverance. No one yet suspected that these 12 ships carried to Europe the greatest catastrophe in its history, a plague that, within 7 years, would wipe out a third of the continent's population, turning once blooming cities into graveyards and villages into wastelands where only the wind howled through abandoned houses. Mid-14th century Europe seemed to be living its golden age. The population of the continent had reached an unprecedented 75 million. Cities were alive with activity. At dawn, bells summoned artisans to their workshops. At the markets, merchants praised their goods in a dozen languages, while in the evenings laughter and songs drifted from taverns. Great cathedrals raised their spires toward the heavens, stone prayers, symbols of faith and prosperity, built without sparing time or gold. Peasants cultivated every inch of arable land, from the coasts to the mountain slopes. In spring, the fields shimmered with green shoots. In summer, they ripened into golden seas of wheat and rye. In autumn, the granaries overflowed with grain. Merchants traced new trade routes, Flemish cloth to Italy, Italian silk to England, English wool to Flanders. In the guild workshops, craftsmen perfected their skills. Armorers forged swords that could cleave iron nails. Jewelers created ornaments worthy of royal treasuries. Yet beneath this outward prosperity ran deep cracks in the foundation of European civilization. The climate was growing colder. The Little Ice Age had begun to affect harvests. Winters grew harsher, spring came later, and summers were short and wet. Frequent crop failures weakened the population, especially in the north, where people survived for months on bread made from bark and acorn flour. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 was a grim warning of what was to come. That year, rain fell endlessly through spring and summer, washing away crops and turning roads into impassable swamps. Chroniclers of the time recorded horrifying scenes. Mothers abandoned newborns at church doors, unable to feed them. In the cities, people traded family heirlooms for a handful of grain. The streets filled with emaciated figures who gnawed bark, grass, even dirt. Hundreds of thousands perished, revealing just how fragile the fabric of European civilization truly was. At the same time, Europe's growing trade connected it with distant lands through a vast web of routes, a spider's web woven across the known world. Italian merchants felt at home in the ports of Crimea and Constantinople, where their trading posts stood beside Byzantine palaces and Tatar yurts. Florentine bankers financed expeditions to faraway lands. Their golden florins were accepted from London to Cairo. Genoese and Venetian ships sailed regularly between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, their holds filled with spices from India, silks from China, and furs from Rus. But the same network that had brought Europe wealth and prosperity would soon become the pathway for the deadliest disease in human history. Like blood through the veins of a giant body, the trade routes carried not only goods and gold, but invisible messengers of death. The disease that would come to be known as the Black Death was not new to the world. Bubonic plague had existed for millennia, sleeping in the depths of the steppes and deserts, awakening from time to time to claim thousands of lives. Its culprit, the microscopic bacterium Yersinia pestis, lived among rodent colonies in the grasslands of Central Asia, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Great Wall of China. Fleas, those tiny bloodsuckers that infested rats and ground squirrels, carried the infection from one animal to another, and sometimes to humans, becoming wingless angels of death. The first outbreaks of the new epidemic were recorded in China and Mongolia in the 1320s. Chinese chronicles described a strange illness that struck people faster than locusts devour crops. In the province of Yunnan, entire villages died out in a matter of days. The victims bore dark spots on their bodies and bloody foam on their lips. Gradually, the disease spread along the routes of the Silk Road, following caravans and their cargo. Every inn, every warehouse became a potential nest of infection. Rats, humanity's eternal companions, carried the infected fleas that transmitted the disease. Gray ship rats, black barn rats, field rats from the farms, all could become carriers of death. When a rat died of plague, starving fleas would abandon its cooling corpse, seeking new hosts. If no other rat was near, they bit humans, injecting the deadly bacteria into their blood. By the mid-1340s, the plague had reached the shores of the Caspian and Black Seas. Cities like Sarai, the splendid capital of the Golden Horde, where mosques stood beside Christian churches, Astrakhan, the meeting point of European and Asian merchants, and Tana, at the mouth of the Don River, where Genoese traded with Russian princes, all fell victim one after another. The trading colonies of the Italian merchants shut down, but not before infected rats had slipped aboard ships bound for European ports. Caffa, modern-day Feodosia, was the jewel of the Genoese trading empire on the Black Sea. The city was a dazzling mix of cultures. Ships bearing the flags of a dozen nations crowded its harbor. Voices in many tongues filled the streets, and in the markets one could buy everything civilization then produced, from English tin to Chinese porcelain. The Genoese colony prospered on Eastern trade, its merchants growing rich from reselling Asian goods to Europe. But in 1346, a shadow fell upon Caffa. The armies of the Golden Horde, led by Khan Janibeg, surrounded the city and began a siege. The Khan demanded that the Genoese cease trading with his enemies and pay an enormous tribute. The defenders refused, trusting in their strong walls and aid from the sea. The siege dragged on for almost a year, turning into a war of attrition. The city's defenders survived on hardtack and salted meat, while the besiegers suffered from hunger and disease, as always happens in long campaigns. But it was not battle that decided the fate of Caffa. A new horror began among the Khan soldiers: the plague. At first, a few fell ill, then dozens, then hundreds. They died in terrible agony. Fever seized them, then convulsions. Black spots appeared on their skin, and painful swellings the size of apples formed in their armpits and groins. Within 3 or 4 days, they were dead. Their corpses blackened and rotted rapidly, filling the air with the stench of decay. Khan Janibeg, seeing his army dying faster than the enemy could kill it, was seized with rage. In his desperation before an invisible enemy, he ordered an act that would go down in history as one of the first cases of biological warfare. The bodies of his plague-stricken soldiers were loaded into catapults and hurled over the city walls. Perhaps the Khan hoped to infect the defenders, or perhaps he simply wanted to dispose of the corpses that threatened to spread disease in his own camp. The defenders, seeing the mangled bodies flying over the walls, were horrified. They tried to drag the corpses away with hooks and ropes, casting them into the sea, afraid to touch them with their hands. They burned incense and sulfur in the streets and prayed in every church of the city. But it was already too late. The plague had entered Caffa and began its slow, methodical work. It spared no one. Defenders or townspeople, rich merchants or poor craftsmen, young or old, families perished together. A father worked in his shop in the morning, felt fever by evening, and was dead 2 days later. His wife, caring for him, became infected and died after him. Children, left orphans, either starved or succumbed to the same disease. Entire neighborhoods stood empty. Streets were littered with corpses. Trade stopped. The air reeked of decay and the smoke of funeral pyres. Those few Genoese who could still move fled in panic, loading their ships with whatever valuables they could carry: gold, jewels, family treasures, unaware that the most precious and deadly cargo aboard was death itself. In the dark corners of the holds, among bales of silk and sacks of spices, rats scurried. On their fur clung fleas whose bellies swarmed with millions of plague bacteria. Thus began the journey of the Black Death to Europe. In the spring of 1347, several Genoese ships left the cursed port of Caffa, carrying the last survivors of the siege. They fled across the Black Sea, hoping to reach Constantinople, then the great capital of the Eastern Empire, a city of gold domes and marble palaces. But death sailed with them. During the voyage, sailors began to fall ill one by one. At first they thought it was exhaustion or bad food or seasickness, but soon the symptoms became unmistakable: fever, black spots on the skin, and swollen buboes that oozed pus and blood. Those who tried to help the sick caught the disease themselves, and within days the ships became floating tombs. When the first of these vessels reached Constantinople, it brought with it not silk or spices, but the seeds of the apocalypse. The disease spread through the port, then through the narrow, crowded streets of the city. The plague knew no boundaries of faith or language. Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Turks, all fell equally before it. By the end of the year, Constantinople was paralyzed. The streets were filled with the wails of the dying. The Byzantine chronicler Nicephorus Gregoras wrote that corpses lay in heaps like piles of firewood, and that the living could not bury the dead fast enough before they themselves fell beside them. The once mighty capital of the Eastern Empire became a city of silence, broken only by the sound of tolling bells and the flapping of crows' wings. From Constantinople, merchant ships carried the plague westward, to the islands of the Aegean, to Alexandria, to the ports of Italy. In Messina, on the island of Sicily, the first Genoese galleys arrived in October 1347. The townspeople rushed to the harbor to greet them, expecting exotic goods from the east. Instead, they found ships manned by the dead. Within days, the disease spread through Messina like wildfire. Those who could fled into the countryside, carrying the infection with them. In panic, the city authorities ordered the ships expelled from the harbor. But by then, it was far too late. The rats had already disembarked, scurrying into warehouses, granaries, and homes. The fleas followed them, leaping onto new hosts. Death had set foot on European soil. The plague then moved north along the trade routes like a dark tide. From Sicily to Genoa, Pisa, and Venice, the lifeblood of the Mediterranean world became the veins through which the infection spread. From Venice it reached the Po Valley, then Provence, then Marseille. By early 1348, the Black Death had engulfed the south of France and crossed the Alps into Switzerland. By summer it reached Paris, the heart of medieval Europe, and there it raged with unimaginable fury. Contemporary witnesses struggled to describe what they saw. In Florence, the chronicler Matteo Viani wrote that no bells tolled, no prayers were heard. The fear of death silenced every voice. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, the river Rhone was so full of corpses that barges had to push them aside to pass. In London, the historian Henry Knighton noted that the churchyards could not contain the dead, and men were forced to bury them in great pits, 20, 30, or 40 at once. The mortality was staggering. In some places, half the population died within a few months. Whole families vanished, leaving their houses locked from the inside. Fields went untilled, workshops fell silent, and trade collapsed. It seemed that the very fabric of society was disintegrating. The people of the 14th century could not understand what was happening to them. Medicine had no concept of bacteria or contagion. Physicians blamed the alignment of planets, bad air, divine punishment, or poisoned wells. Some believed that the Jews had conspired to destroy Christendom and launched pogroms in which thousands of innocent people were slaughtered. Others joined flagellant processions, barefoot men in rags, marching through towns and villages, whipping themselves until their backs bled, begging God for mercy. But the heavens remained silent. Death continued its march across Europe. The Black Death struck with terrifying speed. In its bubonic form, it began with fever, chills, and exhaustion. Then, dark swellings, buboes, appeared in the groin, armpits, and neck. They grew to the size of apples, turned black, and filled with pus. Victims burned with fever, shivered uncontrollably, and writhed in unbearable pain. The stench of decay seemed to rise from their very flesh. Those who touched the sick often fell ill themselves within a few days. Even priests and doctors who tried to help perished by the thousands. A more terrible form, the pneumonic plague, attacked the lungs. Victims coughed blood, gasped for air, and died within 1 or 2 days. Still worse was the septicemic form, when the poison spread through the bloodstream, turning the skin black before death arrived, sometimes within hours. No one could predict who would live or die. The healthy collapsed in the streets. A mother could bury her child in the morning and die herself by evening. Neighbors abandoned each other. Husbands fled from wives, parents from children. Those who dared to show compassion were the first to perish. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio wrote, "Fathers and mothers refused to visit their children. Brothers fled from brothers. The sick were left alone in their houses, where they died without aid or prayer. The air itself seemed poisoned. People carried bunches of herbs and flowers to ward off the miasma. They burned aromatic resins in their homes and walked with vinegar-soaked cloths pressed to their faces. Doctors, dressed in long robes and beaked masks filled with herbs, became the most terrifying figures of the age, symbols of death rather than healers. Their staffs were used not to examine patients, but to push corpses aside. The cities turned into places of horror. In Paris, Florence, and Venice, the sound of carts filled with corpses echoed through the streets. The graveyards overflowed. New mass graves were dug outside city walls, where the dead were thrown together without coffins or prayers. The ground rose like waves under the weight of the buried. In some towns, the living could no longer keep up with the dead. Dogs and pigs wandered the streets, feeding on the bodies of those no one had buried. The smell of rot and smoke filled the air. Night never seemed to end, as if the sun itself had turned its face from the world. People sought explanations and salvation wherever they could. Priests preached repentance, saying the plague was God's punishment for human sin. Astrologers blamed the alignment of Saturn and Jupiter. Some claimed that witches had cursed the land. Superstition flourished, and fear turned to madness. In Germany and Switzerland, mobs of fanatics, the flagellants, marched from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in hopes of cleansing humanity from sin. They sang hymns and begged forgiveness, but their processions only spread the infection further. The Church, unable to stop the plague, began to lose its moral authority. Even the Pope, Clement VI, fled from Avignon, surrounding himself with fires that he believed would purify the air. But nothing could stop the invisible enemy. The plague swept through Europe like a storm, devouring everything in its path: cities, kingdoms, dynasties, and faith itself. By the time the plague's first wave had passed, Europe was unrecognizable. Entire regions lay deserted. Once prosperous towns stood silent, their houses empty, their streets overgrown with grass. Church bells no longer rang for the dead. There were too many to count. In some parishes, every priest had perished. In others, there were no parishioners left to bury. In the countryside, the fields lay fallow. There were not enough peasants left to till the soil or gather the harvest. Oxen wandered freely, plows rusting in the rain. The grain rotted where it had grown. Famine followed the plague, and with it, despair. Yet in the midst of the horror, the survivors began to see the world differently. For centuries they had lived within a rigid order, the great pyramid of feudal Europe. At the top, kings and lords; below, the church; at the bottom, the peasants who sustained them all. The plague shattered this order like glass. With so many dead, labor became precious. Those who survived could demand higher wages, better treatment, and even freedom from their lords. For the first time, peasants realized their own value. Serfdom began to crumble, not through rebellion, but through necessity. Landowners, desperate for workers, offered incentives that would have been unthinkable a generation before. A new social order began to take shape. The church, too, was shaken to its core. The priests had preached that the plague was God's punishment, yet the wicked and the righteous died alike. People saw the hypocrisy of indulgences and the futility of prayers that brought no salvation. The authority of the church, unchallenged for centuries, began to crack. In that crack, new ideas would one day grow, ideas of reform, science, and reason. Fear of death changed art, faith, and the imagination. Painters and sculptors, once obsessed with saints and paradise, now turned their gaze to decay and mortality. The skeleton became a familiar image, not only as a warning, but as a companion. Murals of the Dance of Death, where skeletons led kings, popes, and peasants hand in hand to the grave, appeared on church walls across Europe. Life and death were now seen as inseparable, one endless dance. In literature, too, a new voice emerged, more personal, more human. Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in plague-ravaged Florence, told the story of 10 young people who fled the city to escape death. They passed their days telling stories, tales of love, wit, and deceit. It was not only a masterpiece of storytelling, but also a mirror of a changing world. Boccaccio's heroes no longer lived by divine command. They lived by their own desires, their own reason, their own will to survive. The Black Death stripped away illusions. It revealed how fragile civilization was, and yet how adaptable humanity could be. From the ashes of despair, new values were born: curiosity, skepticism, and the belief that life on earth mattered as much as life after death. It was the beginning of a slow awakening, the first flicker of the Renaissance. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Europe was no longer the same. Those who had survived looked upon the world with different eyes. They had seen death so closely that fear itself had lost its power. People began to think not only of salvation, but of life, of what it meant to live, to love, to build, and to create. In Florence, new hospitals appeared. The Santa Maria Nuova, where doctors for the first time began to keep written records of their patients. Medicine, born from helplessness, slowly turned toward science. Physicians studied anatomy and contagion, questioning old dogmas. Observation began to replace superstition. It was the first spark of modern medicine. Art, too, was transformed. Painters and sculptors turned their gaze from heaven to earth, from angels to people. The human body, once seen as sinful flesh, became a vessel of beauty and divine proportion. In The Triumph of Death by Andrea Orcagna, or the frescoes of the Dance of Death in Lubeck, one can still see the shadow of the plague. but also the new realism that would later flourish in the Renaissance. Faces became more human, emotions more real. Wrinkles, pain, and imperfection were no longer hidden. They were part of truth itself. Literature found its new voice as well. Boccaccio's Decameron was not just a masterpiece. It was a testament to human resilience. He showed that even as death swept through the streets, the human spirit could still laugh, desire, and dream. His heroes, escaping the plague to tell stories in the countryside, symbolized a new worldview, freedom from fear, a rediscovery of life's fleeting beauty. Politically, the Black Death reshaped Europe from its roots. The collapse of feudalism gave rise to centralized monarchies. Kings began to rely less on nobles and more on loyal administrators, merchants, and cities. The old order of lords and vassals was fading. In its place, nations were being born. France under Charles V built a standing army that no longer depended on feudal levies. In England, Edward III strengthened Parliament, where not only nobles but also townsmen had a voice. In Spain, the crowns of Castile and Aragon allied with the growing power of the towns against the weakened aristocracy. Europe was changing, politically, socially, spiritually. But this rebirth came at a terrible price. The Black Death had killed a third of humanity, perhaps 50 million souls. It erased villages, dynasties, languages, and memories. And yet, paradoxically, it became the very crucible from which the modern world emerged. The survivors inherited not only the land of the dead, but also their lessons. They learned that fate was not unchangeable, that human effort, not only divine will, could shape the world, that knowledge, observation, and creativity were as sacred as prayer. From this realization came the Renaissance, a new faith in man himself. The same hands that once dug graves would soon carve marble into forms of timeless beauty. The same minds that had feared God's wrath would begin to explore the heavens with telescopes and question nature through science. The Black Death ended an age and began another. The medieval world, with its rigid hierarchies and blind faith, died with the millions who perished. From its ashes rose a new world, curious, ambitious, and unafraid. The world of the Renaissance, the world of discovery, invention, and humanism. A world that for the first time looked not only to heaven, but also to itself. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe.